What if being homeless wasn't what defined you, but what gave you the power to change someone else's life forever? On the unforgiving streets of the city, 11-year-old Jasmine has learned to become invisible. His torn clothes and fraying shoelaces helping him blend into the shadows. But on one fateful day, this young black boy who society had forgotten would do something unforgettable. When disaster strikes one of the city's most influential figures, it's not their wealthy friends or the emergency services who step up, it's Jasmine. From the depths of poverty, he rises to perform an act of courage that forces an entire city to question everything they thought they knew about worth, value, and what makes a true hero. This isn't just a story about saving a life. It's about how one child's bravery shattered the mirrors of prejudice that had blinded an entire community. What happens next would change not just Jasmine's life, but the way an entire city sees its most vulnerable citizens. The streets were both her enemy and her home, despite the heavy weight of her reality. Jasmine never let the harshness of life break her spirit. Her face was often streaked with dirt, and her hair was unkempt, but her eyes glimmered with something more, hope. She was a kid who had seen far too much for someone her age. But Jasmine still held on to the belief that something better was out there. That belief made her different from the other kids in her neighborhood. The world might have written her off, but she refused to let that stop her from pushing forward. Every day was a cycle of survival. Jasmine was often seen sitting on street corners, eyes scanning the crowd for any opportunity. She spent most of her time rummaging through trash cans, trying to find discarded food or anything she could use to make her life just a bit easier. People passed her by, ignoring her presence, pretending she wasn't even there. Some would glance her way, but not many. To them, Jasmine was just another invisible kid, a part of the backdrop, another face among many, in a world that had no time for people like her. To those who did notice her, Jasmine was a reminder of everything they didn't want to acknowledge. A black girl, homeless, her ragged clothes and dirt-streaked face were all they saw. Never the sharp intelligence in her eyes, never the kindness that lingered in her heart despite all she had endured. To them, Jasmine was nothing more than a statistic, an outsider, someone who didn't belong in their world. As Jasmine walked, she couldn't help but notice the bustling crowds that streamed past her. People moved in every direction, all absorbed in their own lives, indifferent to her existence. The sharp click of high heels, the constant beeping of phones, the hum of conversations, all of it blended into a symphony of apathy. She was just another face in the crowd, barely worth a second glance. No one cared about the girl who walked in the shadows. And yet, there was one person who stood out from the rest. Kiara Lucas. She was walking briskly, flanked by her colleagues. Her posture radiated confidence and authority. Kiara was the FBI chief, a respected and powerful woman who had earned her place at the top. Her colleagues whispered in admiration as she moved through the busy streets, surrounded by the kind of respect Jasmine could only dream of. Her uniform was pristine, her heels clicking with a rhythm that matched her unwavering confidence. In her world, there was no room for doubt, no hesitation. She was in control, and no one could challenge that. But even Kiara Lucas, with all her power, was vulnerable in this crowded, indifferent city. As she stepped away from a meeting with important figures, her stride faltered. A piece of food stuck in her throat caused her to cough violently. She grabbed her throat with both hands, panic flashing across her face as she gasped for air. Her colleagues didn't notice at first. The crowd, moving in their usual fashion, barely glanced her way. Kiara's face reddened. and her breathing became shallow as she fought to clear her throat, but it was no use. The choking sensation intensified, and her hands trembled as she struggled for a breath that wouldn't come. The busy street, filled with people who passed by without a second thought, seemed deaf to her distress. The sounds of the city drowned out her quiet gasps for help. Kiera's world, usually so controlled and confident, was suddenly slipping out of her hands. Kiera needed help, but the people around her, oblivious to the danger she faced, continued walking without noticing the woman struggling for her life. It was then, as Kiera stumbled forward, clutching her throat, that Jasmine's eyes caught sight of her. She was standing at the edge of the crowd, watching the scene unfold before her. The chaos of the streets, the rush of people, couldn't distract Jasmine from the woman's distress. Her heart raced. Something told her this wasn't just another day. The woman needed help. And in that moment, despite her own hardships, Jasmine's instincts kicked in. She couldn't stand by and do nothing. The city may have ignored her, but Jasmine wasn't about to ignore someone else's pain. Jasmine's eyes locked onto Kiera as she gasped for air, her face flushed with panic. Her heart raced, but her body acted instinctively. She'd seen people choke before, on food, on smoke, on life. And in those moments, Jasmine had learned the importance of being quick. She didn't hesitate. Without thinking about the crowd that stood frozen in confusion, she pushed through them, weaving between people who were too stunned to react. The noise of the city, the sounds of feet shuffling, and the murmur of voices faded away. In her mind, there was only one thing: Kiera's desperate struggle to breathe. Jasmine reached her in seconds. She was small, but her arms were strong from years of surviving on the streets. She placed her hands firmly on Kiera's abdomen, just as she had seen in movies and street videos. Her heart pounded, and her palms were sweaty, but her hands were steady. She gave the first hard thrust. Nothing happened. Kiera's face remained pale, her mouth still open in silent desperation. The crowd began to murmur again, voices rising in doubt. A few people made hesitant steps forward but stopped, unsure of what to do. Jasmine took a deep breath, pushed harder, and with a final, forceful thrust, the obstruction came loose. Kiera's eyes went wide as she suddenly coughed violently, gasping for air. Her body jerked forward as a piece of food shot from her throat, and she sucked in a deep, desperate breath. For a moment, the world around them seemed to freeze. Kiera stood there, still in shock, her hands clutching her throat, but her breath was coming back. The immediate panic on her face slowly transformed into relief as she looked at Jasmine, her eyes wide with disbelief. I can breathe," she gasped, her voice hoarse. She looked at her, her hands still shaking, but there was awe in her expression. "You saved me?" The crowd that had been standing in stunned silence began to murmur again, but this time it was different. There was no mockery, no judgment. Instead, they were silent, in awe of what Jasmine had just done. For a moment, the world seemed to shift. Jasmine, the girl who had been invisible just moments before, the girl no one had given a second glance, had just saved the life of one of the city's most powerful figures. The people who had watched, waiting for someone else to act, now stood in stunned silence. Jasmine's hands were still shaking, her heart racing in her chest, but she didn't feel scared anymore. She had done something that mattered, something real. Her instincts had kicked in, and she had done what needed to be done. Kiera was alive. "Thank you," Kiera said again, her voice breaking with emotion. She reached out to her, her hands still trembling. Jasmine stood there, not sure how to respond. Her life had been filled with moments of fear and survival. But now, right here, she had made a difference. The crowd, realizing what had just happened, began to move, their stares shifting from suspicion to admiration. But Jasmine didn't notice them. She was too busy staring at Kiera, watching as she slowly regained her composure. "I didn't know what to do," Kiera whispered, her voice still strained. "You saved my life." Jasmine nodded, her chest swelling with a sense of pride. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about doing what was right. And she had done just that. But as the murmurs began to swell, Jasmine's moment of triumph quickly soured. The stares she had felt before, those of suspicion and fear, now turned to something worse. Mockery. A white woman in the crowd, her arms crossed and lips curled in disdain, let out a loud, derisive snort. "Why is a kid like her even touching her?" she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Just looking for attention." Jasmine's stomach twisted as the words landed like stones in her chest. She had done something good. She had saved a life, and yet, here she was being belittled for it. She looked around, hoping to find anyone who would step in, but the crowd only grew more hostile. A man, wearing an expensive suit and a smug expression, looked down at Jasmine with a dismissive sneer. "What does she even know about saving lives?" he said, his tone full of judgment, as though Jasmine's very existence was beneath him. The man's words stung, deeper than anything Jasmine had ever felt. Jasmine's exhaustion grew as she stood there, trying to ignore the cruel remarks. The crowd continued, unfazed by the fact that Kiera was alive because of her quick thinking. Their judgments were louder than the relief in Kiera's voice. "You know," a woman behind Jasmine added, her voice dripping with disbelief. "She's just a homeless kid. What kind of hero could she be?" The words echoed in Jasmine's ears, filling her with confusion and frustration. They didn't see her for who she was. To them, she was just a black child from the streets, no different from any other. They couldn't see past their assumptions. They couldn't see the compassion in her eyes, the desperation she had felt to save Kiera, the selflessness that had driven her to act. Jasmine stood silently, every word from the crowd cutting deeper. She had done what they couldn't, what they didn't even think to do. But none of that mattered. They weren't interested in the truth. They weren't interested in the fact that she had acted in a moment of crisis. They only saw her skin, her poverty, and her background. And because of that, she was nothing more than an inconvenience in their minds. She looked at Kiera, standing a few feet away, still recovering. Her eyes were filled with gratitude, her breathing slowly returning to normal. But she didn't speak up. Instead, the space around them filled with the jeers of people who couldn't see the situation for what it truly was. "Probably thinks she's a hero now," someone muttered behind Jasmine, just loud enough for her to hear. "What? Does she think we're all gonna thank her for that?" Jasmine's fists clenched at her sides, but she remained silent. She knew that arguing with them would be pointless. They had already made up their minds about her, and nothing she could say would change that. For a brief moment, Jasmine felt the weight of their cruelty, but then, just as quickly, she remembered why she had acted. She had saved Kiera. She had done something right. And no matter how they saw her, nothing would take that away. Kiera stood tall, her body still trembling from the shock of almost losing her life. But her eyes were now filled with fire. The last remnants of panic had faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of clarity. As the crowd continued to whisper, their mocking glances still directed at Jasmine, Kiera could feel the weight of their judgment like a heavy cloak. She wiped her mouth, still feeling the lingering tightness in her throat, and as she took a steadying breath, she turned to face the crowd. Her gaze cut through them like a blade, her jaw set with unwavering determination. The whispers faltered, and the group fell into an uncomfortable silence. She stepped forward, her voice firm and filled with authority. "This child just saved my life," she said, her tone cutting through the air like a clap of thunder. "What you're doing right now is disgusting." The crowd froze. The insults and mockery that had been aimed at Jasmine, that had been thrown carelessly into the space around them, suddenly felt insignificant in the presence of Kiera's powerful words. She wasn't just speaking for Jasmine. She was speaking for every person who had ever been judged based on their appearance, their background, or the color of their skin. She took another step forward, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You see a black child who's homeless, and you immediately assume he's nothing. But look at him. He's the only one here who had the courage to act. You don't see his worth because of his skin, but he's worth more than all of you put together." Her words struck like a fist to the gut. The onlookers were silenced, their eyes now wide with realization. They hadn't just mocked Jasmine. They had missed the opportunity to see a hero standing right in front of them. A boy who had acted with bravery when no one else would. Kiera's gaze shifted to Jasmine, her admiration for him now palpable. She turned back to the crowd, her voice unwavering as she continued, "Don't you dare judge him. He is a hero. Just because he looks different from you doesn't make him any less." Her words echoed in the silence that had now descended upon the crowd, a stark reminder of the prejudice that had clouded their minds just moments before. Jasmine stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. He had saved Kiera. He had done what no one else could or would do. And now, Kiera, someone so powerful, so respected, was standing up for him. He could hardly believe it. The shame and doubt that had flooded him earlier began to fade. The onlookers, who had once been quick to judge, were now staring at Jasmine with a different kind of awareness. Some avoided his gaze, embarrassed by their previous comments, while others seemed to reflect on Kiera's words. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and heavy, as they were forced to reckon with the injustice they had just perpetuated. Kiera took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the crowd. "You don't know him," she said, her voice softer but no less powerful. "But I do, and I will make sure the world knows that this child, this boy, is worth more than your ignorance." The silence hung for a moment longer, then slowly began to break. The crowd shuffled, some turning away, others lowering their phones. The harsh words, the mockery, the assumptions, all of it had been exposed for what it truly was, shameful and unfounded. Kiera, with one final glance at Jasmine, walked away with her daughter, leaving the crowd to reflect on their actions. Jasmine stood in the middle of the street, feeling something new, a sense of dignity for the first time in his life. He felt seen for who he truly was. Kiera walked toward Jasmine, her steps slow and deliberate. The chaos of the crowd seemed to quiet as she approached him, her gaze softening. The tension in the air, thick with the weight of her words, hung heavy around them. Kiera stopped just in front of Jasmine, her face filled with gratitude and admiration. She crouched down to his level, her knees pressing gently into the concrete. For a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. The murmurs of the crowd, the harsh stares, the dismissive glances, all of it faded as Kiera placed a hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere, and for the first time her tone was gentle, not commanding. "You're a true hero." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected this. Never imagined that someone like Kiera, someone so powerful and respected, would speak those words to him. For a moment, he felt the weight of her praise settle in, but it wasn't just her words that struck him. It was the way she saw him, the way she truly saw him, not as just a homeless black boy, but as someone with value, someone worthy of respect. Kiera reached down and carefully removed her badge, the symbol of her authority and power. She held it in her hand for a moment, her fingers wrapping around it as she looked at Jasmine. Then, with a deep breath, she held it out to him. "You deserve recognition," she said, her voice filled with both emotion and determination. "You deserve everything I can give you." Jasmine stared at the badge, his hands shaking slightly as he reached out to take it. The weight of it, both physically and symbolically, seemed to anchor him in place. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was the acknowledgement of his worth. It was proof that his actions, his heart, and his bravery had made an impact in a way that words could never fully describe. The crowd, still standing at a distance, had begun to shift. Phones that had once been held high, capturing every moment of Jasmine's supposed crime, slowly dropped to the sides of their owners. The sounds of murmuring started to grow, though this time the tone was different. It was quieter, almost sheepish. Some of the onlookers shifted uncomfortably, their faces flushed with embarrassment. They began to understand in that moment just how wrong they had been. Their judgments, their prejudices, their assumptions, they had all been exposed for what they truly were. The crowd began to realize that Jasmine hadn't acted out of a desire for attention. He had acted out of compassion. He had saved a life, and the color of his skin had nothing to do with it. One by one, the apologies began. "I'm sorry," a woman said, her voice barely audible. "I should have never assumed." She trailed off, and another voice followed. "I was wrong." "Thank you, Jasmine." Even those who had spoken the harshest words now seemed to realize the depth of their mistake. The once hostile crowd, which had stood against Jasmine, now stood in collective silence, realizing the enormity of their bias. The damage had been done, yes, but in this moment, Jasmine had done something that they could never undo. Their misconceptions had been shattered. As Kiera stood and watched, she felt a small sense of peace. She had done what she could for Jasmine, but it was clear that his bravery, his selflessness, had done the heavy lifting. It had not just saved her life. It had exposed a truth far deeper than any of them could have imagined. True worth cannot be measured by appearances. The city, once oblivious to Jasmine's existence, was now forced to reflect on their preconceived notions and biases. What had happened on that street had changed something deep within them. It was no longer just about race, class, or background. It was about recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of where they came from or how they looked. It was a lesson in humility, empathy, and the power of kindness. In the final moments of the story, we see Jasmine walking alongside Kiera. The cityscape behind them reflects the change that has taken place, both in the physical world and in the world of their hearts. No longer a homeless boy, Jasmine was now a young man full of promise and potential. He had been given a second chance, a chance that many others never get. But what was even more powerful was the transformation in the hearts of those who had once looked at him as nothing more than a statistic. They had seen him save a life, and in doing so, he had saved them from their own biases and ignorance. As Jasmine walked, his stride was confident, and his future, once uncertain, was now filled with possibilities. The story of his courage had touched lives, and in turn, it had changed the hearts of those around him. This was a moment that would be remembered, not just for the heroic act, but for the lessons it taught. Lessons about judgment, about kindness, and about how the world can change when we choose to see people for who they truly are.